Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. We are here at ISPI talking about today Libya. The title of this panel is Libya at a Political Impasse, and this panel is organized within the framework of the 8th edition of the Rome Med Dialogues. Today I have a panel with extraordinary colleagues talking about Libya, as I said. So we have Jalel Harshawi, a senior fellow and researcher specialized in Libya, Virginie Colombier, senior associate research fellow at MENA Center ISPI and professor at European University Institute, and Emad Badi, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. So the situation in Libya is very complicated in the last few months, but at this point in the last few years, let's say, after years of civil wars, now the situation is even more complicated. After a moment of peace and a long ceasefire, long for Libya, of course, it was 1 year. There was the formation of a new government, the government of national unity, with Prime Minister Abdulhamid Dbeiba, and there was a real enthusiasm for this moment. This government was decided to lead the country towards elections, and the elections had to be held last December, but in the end it was impossible. So the government should have been expired, but Mr. Dbeiba decided that it was not the case, and but at that point, on the other side of the country, in Cyrenaica, the House of Representatives, another important political organism, decided to have another prime minister. And so at this point, we have a new government, the government of national stability, and with Prime Minister Fathi Bashagha. Fathi Bashagha is not a new entry, of course, in Libya. He was Minister of Interior during the government of national accord, led by Fayez al-Sarraj, and he's a man from Misrata. And so at this point, the international community has been silent. Stephanie Williams of UNSMIL tried to offer a mediation, but there was apparently at the moment it's still impossible. Dbeiba refused to hand power to Bashagha. So now we are in front of a real impasse, and signs of turmoils are, growing always more and more. And so we would like to talk today with our panelists about the situation, the actual situation, why we are here, and what are the possible scenarios for the future. So, Jalel, I would like to start with you, if it's possible. And so I've been very superficial, but I would like that you explain us, what do you think, first of all, of this double government, and which is not new, by the way, in Libya, and what this kind of division means for the stability of the country.
Well, thank you very much, Federica, for the opportunity to speak, for having me. It's always a pleasure to be associated with ISPI, and also a joy to listen to Virginie and Emad. The strategy of Bashagha is interesting because he took a lot of risk, and it's not a brand new strategy. It basically got built up over the last 2 to 3 years, and he basically, the idea is something that kind of took shape in early 2020. Right after he signed as an interior minister, he's the one who actually signed the defense memorandum of understanding with Turkey. And he understood two things at a point in time, early 2020. He understood that Turkey was serious about its intervention. In other words, it was going to be very likely to win and succeed in its mission. The mission was going to consist in protecting Tripoli and making sure that Haftar gets defeated in the northwestern part of Libya. And the other thing that he understood was that Turkey was not likely to go to the east and help Libyans from the west crush Haftar. So Haftar was, in all likelihood, not going to be destroyed. So this basically, from a political perspective, created an opportunity for to use a simplistic analogy, a Nelson Mandela kind of figure, calling for reconciliation and being from the west, reaching out to the east. And that's essentially the strategy that he came up with in early 2020. And it didn't work in February 2021. Dbeibeh won the designation process. And what's interesting is that in 2020, he was already in alliance, in partnership with Aguila Saleh, the figure that you mentioned earlier from Tobruk, the president of parliament. And so for his second try, so we're basically witnessing his second try, and he added to this set of allies or partners, one important ally that was made explicit in February was and January was Marshal Haftar and his sons. And the other important part of this combination is a friendship, or at least an opportunistic partnership, with the militias of Zawiya and Tripoli, known for their anti-Turkish sentiment, to use a very simplistic description. And that's basically what is trying to emerge. What I would like to say about, so if you look at his ministers, for example, the Minister of the Interior in the government proposed by Bashagha, you have the brother of an important militiaman from Zawiya, known for illicit activities, known for involvement in migration management, quote unquote, and so on and so forth. And you can see also like pro-Haftar figures as deputy prime ministers for the east, for the southwest. And one thing that I would like to say is that it almost worked. I mean, right now his position is not very promising. But I would like to say that if you paid attention to the negotiations behind the scenes, and I got like a few bits of what was happening during the month of March, the last 2 weeks before Ramadan, there was a situation where Turkey was really listening closely to whatever arguments Bashagha was prepared to give. In other words, promises and assurances. And I would say the same thing happened in Misrata. Bashagha uses this narrative that he's from the stronghold of revolutionary sentiment, this big city, important city of Misrata. But, yesterday there was a national interest article co-signed by an Eastern Libyan who in 2019 supported the attack on Tripoli. He's basically mentioned the power base of Bashagha in Misrata. That power base in Misrata is not very significant. That was one limiting factor this year for Bashagha. He basically presents himself as this revolutionary figure from Misrata, which he is, but the problem is that politically he's not receiving enough support from his hometown, Misrata. And there was also skepticism in Ankara. And there was at least 2 weeks in the later part of March where he could have said things like, I'm associated with Aguila Saleh from Parliament, we're going to get you the ratification of the Maritime Memorandum of Understanding of November 2019. He didn't say anything like this. He kept saying, I'll take care of things. I'm who I am, you've known me, things are going to go okay. But in terms of presenting arguments that were going to be more convincing from Ankara's perspective, Turkish perspective, he, I would say, missed that opportunity. And things now are not completely hopeless, but they're not looking as good as they did in March.
But in this situation with Bashagha in a gray zone, let's say, what is the role Beiba, and there is a future, a possibility for a collaboration, as there has been a possibility between Bashagha and Aguila Saleh. I mean, something particular in a few years ago, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, in early March, Dbeibeh was the one refusing any kind of conversation with Bashagha. And his reasoning, which I think is rational and logical, he basically considered that any kind of sit down with Bashagha was basically suicide. That was true from Dbeibeh's perspective in early March. Now it's kind of the other way around. The underdog is now Bashagha. And I think Bashagha knows that there's no reasonable solution that he can survive. So technically he could say, let's create a committee and I'm going to continue governing outside of Tripolitania and have a good, deputy prime minister in Benghazi, Ali Qatrani, and another one in Fazan, Salem Zedma, and I'm going to represent the vast majority of the territory. And then you have this holdout prime minister, and in our generosity, we're going to kind of accept an intermediary solution with him. That he cannot say this because Dbeibeh is holding on to the levers of power. We're not going to go through the details. The central bank being able to convince states that matter, like Italy or Britain or a few others like Algeria and Tunisia. And if there were any kind of mediation, then Bashagha could say yes to it technically. And then what you would see effectively is that his deputy prime ministers will do okay in Benghazi and the Fazan, and Bashagha will just basically drown silently, because his role in this story, his job was to enter Tripoli and physically topple Dbeibeh. He failed so far. So he cannot really justify his existence within the context of a reasonable solution, and he knows it.
It reminds me something like Ukraine, what we are watching and seeing Ukraine, of course, in a different level, a different situation, whatever. But the idea, that when someone has the power, then it's very difficult to cut it. And talking about this, I'd like to know just something about the situation. We know that Maghreb and all that part of Africa is a huge importer of from Ukraine and Russia in terms of food, wheat, and so on, grain. So what do you see? I mean, I've seen also in the last few days that the oil fields are closed. Militias are running all over, the oil fields. And I read that, that Dbeibeh defined the clashes in Zawa family disputes. So at this point, we have problems with oil. With probably food. I mean, I'd like to know something from you about, the consequences of the war in Ukraine, because there is a connection.
Yeah, I mean, Libya is in a weird situation because, it made something like somewhere between $25 and $29 billion last year. And if you assume no blockade, which unfortunately there is a blockade now of 600,000 barrels a day, costing $60 million a day for the last few days, and it might continue or even grow. But without the blockade, you could very well see a situation where Libya would make somewhere between 45 and 50 billion this year. So what I mean is that you have effectively a government. I'm talking about the Tripoli one, the GNU, the Dbeibeh one, that is very distracted by all these intrigues. And number two, with still this mentality that there's a lot of money coming in, even if, let's assume that the blockade gets resolved within a few weeks, then all we have to do is basically pay up. And so what we might see is effectively the wheat being purchased, and then we realize at the end of the year that it was purchased as an exceedingly and really a price that is not responsible or anything like that. And we could also see a situation where the distraction is so acute that there ends up to being like some serious shortages, even if Libya has the money, simply because politically it's so dysfunctional. Right now there's no accountability. You have like the economy minister in Tripoli, Mohamed Hawaj, who comes out sometimes, issues like a vague statement and then disappears for a couple of weeks. We don't know. Nobody's asking the right questions. We don't even know whether he's doing a good job or not. He doesn't have a strategy to replace the wheat. And Libya is deeply dependent on both Ukraine and Russia wheat.
Absolutely. So I will keep for me the last question for later, and I'm going now to talk with Virginie, if it's okay for you. Okay, Virginie. So the situation is grim, let's say. Last year, everyone was pretty enthusiastic about the results obtained by the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum. And in reality, nothing worked. Why, in your opinion? And if you can explain a little bit to our audience why there was this Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, and yes, why it didn't work?
Well, thank you, and thank you for the kind invitation. I'm not sure we can actually say that the LPDF did not work at all. If you remember, one of the main objectives of this new format of a political dialogue launched under the supervision of the UN essentially aimed at ending institutional divisions, and especially to reunify the executive government, which had been divided since basically 2014. So in this regard, I think the LPDF did, at the beginning of 2021, some good work, or at least there were some positive achievements. I think the first maybe of the there was something a bit specific in the LPDF that did not really only bring together the key leaders of political factions, but try to, at the same time, bring together representatives of the various political institutions and factions, but also to broaden dialogue a bit and try to bring into the discussions representatives of broader segments of civil society. In that sense, there was an attempt to go beyond this discussions, power deals just between key elites. And the idea was precisely to support the emergence of also new voices. This led to one significant achievement, which was, as I said, the reunification of the executive for the first time since 2014 with the creation of the government led by Abdelhamid Dbeiba. And so this is why you were talking about this enthusiasm that spread very fast at the beginning of 2021. In reality, very rapidly, the success turned into a very deep stalemate. And I think there are a number of reasons for this. I think there are first some contextual reasons. It's very important to remind that even though the war in Ukraine started just 2 months ago, the international environment and the rising tensions between the US, Russia, in particular, but also tensions within the UN Security Council made also the situation in Libya and any international decision-making around Libya very difficult. And so this played an important role. It played an increasingly important role when it coincided with a change of leadership at the head of the UN mission in Libya. I think one of the main factors why also the LPDF didn't work so well in the end, at least could not sustain the positive achievements, is that as soon as the new government, the unified executive was formed, the head of UNSMIL left her position, had to be replaced by another head of mission who was not really ready to play a real mediation role. And he very rapidly left the negotiations to themselves and the negotiators to themselves. So it resulted in a vacuum of which the two leading political institutions in Libya, the House of Representatives and to a lesser extent the High Council, the State Council, immediately took advantage of this situation and literally kidnapped the whole process, took the initiative and put on the table a number of initiatives that then became very difficult to overcome for any mediators. So I think this context, international context, change at the UNSMIL leadership were very significant. But obviously there are also more structural reasons related to the LPDF itself. Maybe to be very fast, the criteria that were used to select the participants have remained very unclear to Libyans and to anybody following the process. There was no real vetting process, and this is how some very polemic personalities and with history of corruption and different misbehavior ended up having a seat at the table. So this lack of vetting process also played a significant role. I would say overall the fact that there was no real transparency and no real control over the process itself was a key element. And I would say something even more important, and that is not so original in Libyan political life, is that very, very rapidly the LPDF, which was supposed to be, diversified in terms of participants and representation, very rapidly ended up reproducing the divisions within the political sphere. Why? Because many of the participants ended up being convinced to join one or the other of the main competing factions. So you ended up with the LPDF, which was merely reproducing the divisions of the overall political sphere, with people really privileging their personal interests, tactical alliances, and not really thinking about what should take place at the country level. And I think this is like a broader illustration of one, I believe, of the key problems in all diplomatic processes or dialogue processes in Libya so far. The fact that the focus has to a large extent remained on personalities rather than on policies and policy priorities. And if you look at the way the Dbeiba government was designated in the end, still you have this idea of alliances of personalities, who can bring the more votes, and no real actual discussion of, okay, what are the priorities for any Libyan government in this moment? What should be the main policy options? And there is probably a need for Libyans and internationals altogether to try and encourage a vision of politics which would be more functional and a bit less personalized. Unfortunately, this does not depend only on international actors, mediators, etc. It's also something that has to be taken on by Libyan elites themselves. And this is probably where I believe even more over the past year, we've realized that this is also something which is missing.
Yes, so this is absolutely, I agree, a real lesson learned in this case. I mean, and the political class in Libya still has, to mature and to grow and to understand that it's not just personal, but it's, for the good of the country in many respects. And for the good of the country, you have to do sometimes agreements that you don't like, but you have to do that. So, in your opinion, apart from this, what are the lessons learned that the international community and also, as you said, Libyans could apply in the future to create something that can, a structure that can this time work? Because now it's more than 10 years after the revolution, and still we are talking about this. Do you think there is a future? We can learn something, we can do something better in this case?
Well, in theory, you can always learn. In practical terms, it's not so obvious, but it's not only about Libya. I would say that there are a number of elements that should be kept in mind when thinking about the future, diplomatic processes, political discussions and negotiations in Libya. Even though I must say that in the current context, the picture is quite gloomy, I would say. First of all, because I don't really see who has the capacity to play the mediator. But I would say that one of the positive steps that was taken with the LPDF was this attempt to broaden and design a political process that would be more inclusive, but most importantly, maybe not restricting the political discussions to political heavyweights or representatives of key factions, trying to dilute this very deeply polarized atmosphere and try to bring in stakeholders, people that may have some kind of influence at the societal level, but more neutral and not necessarily representatives of one or the other camp. But again, I mean, we've seen that it's difficult because it's also very easy for some of the heavyweights to just buy in all of the meanings of the term allegiance and support. But I would say this idea of broadening the scope of participation is something which I believe is very important. I would say the other point, which is related to my previous point, was to incentivize and encourage more focus on policy priorities and focusing not so much on people and alliances between people, but also the idea of a mandate. People can be designated, appointed. What for? I mean, what will be the mission or what will be the priorities of these people? So focusing less on the seats and more on the mandates, I think, is something which should be further insisted. Point to say, and I'm very, very convinced about this, it's a kind of direct consequence of the previous 2 points. I think dialogue needs to be decompartmentalized to a large extent. What I mean here is that not thinking that political figures are the ones who should be talking about political deals and power sharing. Not thinking that the economy should be discussed only between economic experts. I think precisely the contrary is needed and should have probably been implemented earlier. The constitution issue, for instance, should become central to the political process. It should be part of the political deal. Same thing, I believe, political figures should be invited to discuss the economy, because at the end of the day, the economy is and will remain central to the conflict. Armed groups probably should also be part of the discussion on constitution, political guarantees, power structures. So this idea of precisely breaking the silos and have all these various stakeholders take part in discussions. And I think this will be probably a way also to provide guarantees for the various groups. But again, in the current context, I'm very well aware that it sounds like a nice talk, quite difficult to implement, because who is doing that?
Yeah, so in this way, what are the real, core points that the international community and Libyans should try to solve right now? But little steps, not maximum systems, important things that you think that could change, in some way for the better the situation. Because as you said, it's really gloomy and, grim and more and more complex with different actors fighting one against the other. So now there is an economic problem that, of course, impact on the social problem. So what do you think about that?
Well, I'm not sure it's more complex than it was before. It has remained so. No, I think the main issue is that currently the UN is particularly weak and has basically no legitimacy to act as a mediator, or at least much less than before, which is a real problem, because who can mediate? We don't see another party that could probably have the legitimacy and the capacity to mediate between Libyan actors at the moment. As I said, I think there's also an issue because the UN would need, the UN, if it were to play reactivate a political process, needs some support from Libyan political elites, also called political elites. I'm not saying only the key figures among the various factions, but also the political figures or people who are influential in the political and social sphere. And so far, we don't see much happening, unfortunately. So there is a need, and I think in all conversations also with people working on the Libyan file at the international level, there is this acknowledgement that what is missing is also something that would come from Libyans themselves. But I don't see, in the short term, I think, I don't see a move that could be positive without being simultaneous on different tracks. I believe that there is such a lack of trust, which has been the result of, an accumulation of actions and betrayals and tactical and strategic changes, that probably there's a need for a new political deal, but a new political deal probably not intended as another power-sharing agreement based on the realities on the ground now that would then be reversed or contested again after 3 or 4 months. I think the new political deal probably need to work providing guarantees to the various parties at the same time. And I think the priorities here are, on the one hand, the issue of the government, the executive. So there is a need, and this is obvious, for a unified executive, but maybe a limited executive with a specific mandate. I go back to the issue of the priorities. A government to do what? Not to get the seat, but to do something specific. The second issue is the constitution. The constitution is important, even though it's only a constitutional basis for now, because it is also what will provide some guarantees for the functioning of the political system and at least even for a specific period of time. And the third element is also elections, I believe, because don't forget that there was still a very strong interest of the Libyan population to go and vote, not so much for elections as such, I think, more because they are aware that their political institutions and so-called elites have been failing them for the past 10 years. So they want these people to go back home, and they would like people that actually take the priorities of the country into their hands. So I think the idea of a package that would be the core of a new political deal is certainly the way forward. But again, how do you work on this in the absence of a mediator, a recognized mediator, and in the absence of a real push from parts of Libyan society? I think this is why I would be a bit pessimistic, because this cannot come overnight just because you wish for it.
Yeah, and then above all, now there is, this situation, global situation with the war in Ukraine, which is very distracting from the Libyan staff.
No, sorry, I would just maybe in terms of priorities, because I was talking about the mandate and then the policy priorities. I think the economy, and this is something that I think we all agree is something which is key, but the economy at the central and local level. So it's a matter of the economic and financial institutions, but I think there's also something that should be a matter of priority for our government and international actors, which is the provision of services, basic services. If you look at the current situation, how it has evolved also over the past years, there is a need for mechanisms that could ensure that some basic services are provided. And so here, the role of municipalities, how to relate between the central government and the municipalities is certainly something that should be prioritized, because it's a priority for Libyans, and it's also a way to build some kind of accountability. Jalal was talking about, or you were talking about accountability before. I think one of the key issues is that basically you have a layer of political elites, a layer of Libyans, and there's no form of accountability whatsoever. And so how do you work on this? Even the recent political developments with the LPDF did not really fix this.
Yeah, and you can see also, with these politicians like Beiba, for example, and others also, but also Akila Saleh. I mean, when there was the problem, the issue with the elections last December, they could not propose themselves for the elections, and instead they did. And for example, also the House of Representatives is still there after 2014. I mean, so there's no reliability in this sense. So once you get the power, you stay there. It's very rare to see a Libyan politician, make a step back. Usually it happens, but it's really rare. So probably, a direct relationship between the electors and the politician should be, of course, a good point in this sense. Okay, so Emad, you are the last. So as everybody knows, you are an expert of Libya, militias, security, and so we have talked about politics, we have talked about economy, social. I would like to talk a little bit about the security sector, which in Libya is really a tricky point and a difficult point to solve. We have many different militias in all the country, lots of millions, let's say, of weapons. And still, the situation is very, very articulated and very difficult. Seems nothing has changed. What is the situation right now in these days, in the last weeks and months?
Yeah, sure. Thank you to my colleagues for their excellent interventions. I'll try and build on those while I explain the contemporary, let's say, situations. But before that, just like to take a step back, I was going to say, before Virginie mentioned that, it's almost like elections became an afterthought now, which I think speaks to, is rather amazing considering the narrative last year, and now they've become somewhat of an afterthought. But in any case, with the contemporary situation, to build on kind of Jalal's analogy and also on the security situation, Bashagha is turning out to be a very poor man's Nelson Mandela. I don't think that there's in any way, shape, or form, at least with the current government that he has gotten endorsed by Akila Saleh and part of the HOR in Eastern Libya, that he would get in power without provoking some sort of conflict in Western Libya, primarily, I would say, or potentially in other locales in the near or medium term. And that's not willingly. Bashagha wanted to portray himself as this reconciliatory figure and wanted to shift the narrative to a kind of post-war reconciliatory narrative. But the actions, I would say, spoke a little bit louder than the words. And circumstantially speaking, at this stage, the security situation is definitely not as stable as it was before. And what you have emerging landscape-wise is a landscape where actually the armed groups are the ones that are effectively deciding who is the prime minister and who is not, basically, and who is a contender for the prime ministership and who is not. But to take a step back, and kind of look at the situation and relate it to politics, because we can't compartmentalize things. The endorsement of this government by Akila Saleh and by that part of the HOR in that intransparent vote has created a vacuum. And we've gone back to sort of this bifurcation of executive powers. We haven't gone yet to a full, actually, bifurcation of institutions, which is a good thing. But on the opposite side, it has significantly heightened the risk of a relapse into conflict. The fact that we haven't relapsed into conflict now does not speak to domestic will of political stakeholders as much as it speaks to the will of security stakeholders, actually, which do not want the war. And conversely, also social stakeholders, I would say. Libyan society is tired. There's conflict fatigue is still there. Politicians might be as venal as they were before, but for Libyans and some of the armed groups that, let's say, are more representative of constituencies, they don't want another war. They're still reeling from the last one, so they don't want that. But the problem is that's not being translated at a political level. This conflict fatigue and willingness for change has not manifested neither internationally, I would say, with like concrete plans for ways forward. As Virginie mentioned, nothing has been decompartmentalized. There's not a wider discussion happening. Even last year's discussion on elections and the endorsement of the vote was very ludicrous. The framework for the vote, was very ludicrous, to be honest. And it's like we basically had a situation where one person wrote a law and that became the framework for elections. Now the situation is, however, slightly different. Both on the international scene, but also on the domestic scene. Bashagha at the moment is very much under pressure from many sides. It's partly the reason behind several of the tensions that we've seen kind of evolve into minor conflicts over the past couple of weeks, notably the one that you mentioned in Zawiya earlier. Armed groups that allied themselves with Bashagha in Western Libya expect him to kind of follow through on the plan to enter the capital, enter Tripoli. Particularly those whose next of kin, I'd say, were included in his cabinet, basically. But the problem is, during Bashagha's kind of tenure in the stay in Tunis, over the past month, there were several attempts to enter Tripoli, either forcefully or peacefully, let's say. The modus operandi was a bit similar to what Haftar intended, as well, with his offensive in April 4th, 3 years ago. But that didn't pan out, partly because the backdoor deals that were trying to be brokered weren't very inclusive, and partly because of unease, let's say, with Bashagha's alliance with Haftar, which is not, I think, understood at the level of the international policymakers. Maybe they think this is Bashagha's cabinet, but it is not. It's Haftar's cabinet. Most of the people staffing this new government are actually allied with Khalifa Haftar more so than Bashagha. So that understanding has very much settled in and is settling in across several of, I would say, Western armed groups. And they know that on the long run, this will either provoke a conflict or return us to the last year's status quo with a kind of government that only controls part of Western Libya, but which has a fraught relationship with Khalifa Haftar in Eastern Libya. Conversely, what's happening, like aside the Bashagha, let's say, alliance and these attempts, you have Dbeiba, who is benefiting arguably from the moves of his opponents. That's been the long-standing kind of pattern, I would say, since last year, because he benefited from his opponent's move on the election front, and now he's benefiting from their alliance to both get support from local armed groups, but also buy off support or co-opt local armed groups in Western Libya. And that's part of what's buttressing kind of his influence in Western Libya. So you have this contemporary kind of status quo, let's say, where I would say the main benefactors of this reality are, on the one hand, Dbeiba, basically, because primarily of the moves of his opponents, and Haftar, who's emerging kind of as the main interlocutor, regardless of whoever is in power. So regardless of whether Bashagha is prime minister or Dbeiba is prime minister, both would actively seek to either negotiate with him, his sons, or at times his external backers, let's say. Now, Libya is not an island. So if you're speaking of the security situation, you have to also speak a little bit of geopolitics and the geopolitical situation. And what has preserved the peace in Libya since 2020 hasn't necessarily been domestic will, it has been a kind of Turco-Russian, let's say, balance of power. Both of these entities had not repatriated their mercenaries. In fact, they had built up significant influence over the course of the past, I would say, couple of years. They had induced the collapse of Haftar's offensive, obviously with the pullout of Wagner forces that partook in the offensive on Tripoli. But after that, there was kind of a new post-war phase where they ramped up their security assistance with in different formats, I would say. Turkey mostly focused on establishing full control over Wutia, the airbase in western Libya, consolidated its footprint in Masrata, consolidated its footprint in Maitiga, and it secured a presence kind of navally speaking in the Homs area, I would say. And also provides some sort of capacity building to Libyan institutions like defense, interior officials, Coast Guard, etc. Conversely, Russia had also focused on consolidating its presence in kind of central Libya, took over the Fardabia airbase in Sirte, took over Jufra airbase, took over also Al Khadim or Kharouba airbase in eastern Libya at the border with Egypt from the UAE. And for both of these states, their presence in those locales not just allowed them to kind of preserve the peace and be courted by the GNU at the time, but also allowed them to kind of project influence across like Maghreb for, I would say, Turkey, and then sub-Saharan Africa for Russia. Now, that balance of power with the Ukraine war has somewhat shifted, basically. Whether we like it or not, the Turco-Russian balance and even their bilateral relations are somewhat more fraught. So Ukraine is impacting us not just in the kind of political and economic realm in terms of food crises, oil prices, etc., but it's also causing an impact at the level of the security assistance of both of these states are providing, and therefore their relationship and their ability to preserve peace in Libya. Now, Wagner has pulled out partially a number of its forces from central Libya, from central Libya towards Ukraine. First, it was Syrians. Now there are Wagner personnel that are also moving from Libya towards Ukraine. The problem with this dynamic is that the kind of veneer of stability that we had that was preserved by an international, like this international presence, let's say, to be blunt about it, is gone. And combined with the brinkmanship, backdoor deals, unstructured process, and vacuum that currently exists, what you have is a situation where you could very much relapse into conflict. There's no structured process politically, there's no structured process security-wise, and clearly, as per the U.S. statement today, you also see that backdoor deals are operating at the level of the economic realm, let's say, between the NOS, the National Oil Corporation, the central bank, the GNU, etc. That has led to a blockade contemporarily, but that could escalate to manifest into something else in the level of the security realm, let's say, in the coming months, if you want to consider kind of the oil blockade as a form of economic warfare, which I personally do. So that's roughly the current situation as is. But yes, it's very prone to escalation, despite the fact that I would say a critical mass of both people and armed groups don't want it. But in the lack of an alternative, that's automatically what will happen. What will happen? Yeah.
I have a question for you coming from our audience. So Libya lies at the intersection of organized crime networks in the Mediterranean and the Sahel-Saharan Strip. How are illicit trafficking, drugs, weapons, and human smuggling influencing dynamics of cooperation or competition among local actors? How do they manage the transnational dimensions of such flows?
Sorry, just to be clear, are we speaking about global actor or domestic actors in this case?
Well, I'd say in this case, domestic.
Domestic.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what I'll say, and I'll be blunt about this, is that the Fathi Bashagha cabinet in its current format has a significant chance of scaling kind of the state/crime nexus in Libya. Basically, there is high potential for that nexus to significantly penetrate within the state. And I think that's part of the reason why there is a push to reshuffle the Bashagha government. I would say at the moment, the two main qualms that some of those in the policy spheres have with the Fathi Bashagha government is both its composition, because of this state crime nexus, and also the fact that implicitly it is assumed that Russia would have disproportionate influence over the new government, because Haftar is partly beholden to Russia to a certain extent. Now, the latter, the Russian dynamic, is partly tempered by the Ukraine dynamic, ironically. So what's happening in Ukraine is actually almost, ironically speaking, proving a boon to Fathi Bashagha on that front. But the other problem, the state crime nexus, I would say, is a significant problem. Why? Because you see these stakeholders that are oftentimes referred to as security stakeholders, they operate extensively in the illicit economic realm, whether we're talking about fuel smuggling, human smuggling, drug trafficking, etc. They operate in that realm, and the alliance that currently exists, whereas that kind of the status quo that existed before, is they operated more on a localized level. Yes, they had the network that was national, but what was happening in Zawiya was negotiated with Zawiya, its vicinity, sometimes also with the Fazan, etc. What was happening in eastern Libya was partly negotiated to a certain extent with eastern Libya and other nodes of smuggling in the Maghreb, etc. Now, the current government, the Government of National Stability in its current format, includes next to kin of a lot of the figures that are involved in trafficking and in the illicit realm in Libya. So there's a potential for not just these traffics to scale on a national level and therefore on a transnational level, but also of these networks significantly becoming embedded within the state. So you'd see kind of, I don't want to say Libya become a narco state, but that's effectively the path that this government, from my perception at least, would put Libya on. It's a bit of a bleak assessment, but if you look at the background of the figures and their activities on a more local level over the past few years, you clearly see that over time, especially since 2014 onwards, these are figures that have scaled their business in the illicit realm significantly, and that's not a downward trend. It's an upward trend. And with this new government, there's an unprecedented opportunity to gain a state veneer, let's say, over their activities. And I don't think the assumption that Fathi Bashagha, which during his tenure as interior minister was explicitly anti-crime, let's say, has individually the capacity to temper these forces. I don't think that he has the capacity to temper the illicit economic activities, and I also don't think he has neither the social, political, military capital to sustain his alliance with Haftar in the long run. So you're looking at a government that will complicate things more so than it will resolve anything, and so there's very much a need for a third path, I would say, from the current legitimacy dilemma. Ideally, that third path would include elections, because I still think that conversation is important. But as Virginie mentioned, the conversation needs to be both broadened and decompartmentalized for things to be steered towards a more constructive approach. You can't talk about a financial mechanism that just disperses all revenues to all these factions, share the resource, etc., etc. That's not sustainable. It's not what the Libyan people want. It's also not something that will resolve anything in the long run. It will just allow them to share the spoils until their zero-sum inclinations take over again and someone launches an offensive, which is what happened before. We've seen this before, and I think that's part of the reason why society is kind of now also trying to resist what's that, let's say, impulse.
So the scenario is, that we can imagine for the next few months is bad, in your opinion? Absolutely.
I mean, there are several possible military scenarios absent a significant political capital being exerted to break through the contemporary status quo. I think a key problem was actually the UN actually hosting its initiative between the HSC and the HOR in Cairo. I think that significantly affects the perception of that mediation process. So breaking away from that or recovering from that is going to take some time, and time is of the essence, given the dynamics that I outlined. But in terms of actual military scenarios, if we want to talk about that, I'd say they're localized, and these could happen simultaneously as much as they could happen individually. So you have potentially, and I would say the likelihood of this particular conflict was more prominent during the few weeks where Fathi Bashagha was in Tunisia. You have the potential of a conflict in Western Libya escalating with the Zawiya at its epicenter, I would say, and then broaden to include also factions from Tripoli, from Masrata, etc. Then you also have another likelihood of a completely other conflict, which is a conflict in southern Libya. Why? Because the Wagner pullout and the fact that they now can't really put a check on local tensions in southern Libya, because that's the reality that has prevailed over the past year or so, I would say. Their pullout removes this ability to freeze conflict in the Ghazan. So you could also see conflicts that have been simmering there emerge to the fore because of the Wagner pullout and because of the LAAF's inability to kind of assert a monopoly on violence there. The third option would be, and I would put the likelihood of this as less likely, is an offensive on the oil crescent, because I think it's emerging within certain spheres, let's say, of influence within the GNU, that the cycle, let's say, where Haftar is able to blackmail a government through his territory over the oil crescent is something that needs to be dealt with. But so far, there's no political force or critical mass that I see that is willing to actually, let's say, launch an offensive on the oil crescent. That's aside the fact that it would also have a lot of international implications to do that. We haven't seen that happen in a while. The last scenario, which I put as the least likely at this stage, is the complete collapse of the Turco-Russian-induced stalemate and Egypt's attempts at kind of forcing this new government of national stability with arguably French backing as well, triggering a return to an internationalized civil war, let's say, basically. And I would put this as less likely significantly, partially because despite the Turks and the Russian balance not being there, the Turks and the Russians still want to have a relationship, basically, a modicum of a relationship, even if there isn't that balance of power, even if the Turks have a significant military edge over the Russians because of the Ukraine dynamics. I would say that there's that scenario is less likely. But all in all, these are the different scenarios, unfortunately, absent a broader, inclusive deal that deals with also what people want, need, and justice.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ahmad. Jalal, I would ask you if you agree with Ahmad with the possible scenarios, and then I will pass the last word to Virginie and let's conclude her.
Well, I agree that there's a very distinct possibility, not particularly likely, but it's there. It's on the radar screen. There's a possibility for a relapse into internationalized civil wars, just as destructive and lethal as what we saw during the first half of 2020, if not more. Because a lot of the Libyan brigades are on both sides of the aisle are better equipped, more dangerous if they're back into a dynamic if they're forced back into a dynamic of war. And I think it's good to articulate that risk because it does exist. So it's not about saying that it's very probable or that it's the default scenario, but 3 or 6 months ago, none of us were saying that. Now we're saying it, and I think it's important for policymakers to hear it, because there's also a tendency sometimes to have gotten accustomed to this peace for free kind of dynamic in Libya. Like, oh, whatever Turkey and Russia worked out in May 2020 seems to be magically, it's the gift that keeps on giving, like we have this guarantee that peace goes on, and now we have like small skirmishes, but magically we have the guarantee that war is not going to return. That's absolutely untrue. There's a risk for all kinds of scenarios that could lead back to something quite bloody.
Okay. Virginie?
Well, I don't think there's much to add. I think, as both Imad and Jalal mentioned now, I don't think there are any kind of guarantees that the situation cannot evolve in the wrong direction at the security level. But I would say that it's even for this reason more important that something happens at the political, diplomatic level. And the fact that the UN, as Imad mentioned, has now been completely absorbed by this fake discussions between the HOR and the State Council in Egypt, which, when you talk about constitution and elections, etc., is more than, not specifically credible, is problematic. And I have the feeling that because of Ukraine, obviously, Libya has completely been pushed away from the radar, and it's probably time to look at what's happening there again. Not only because of the security risks, but also because there is basically no political process on the table anymore. And again, I think it's also important to start thinking about these various elements all together. Because the political and the economic in particular need to be addressed together for to have a chance to reach some positive but also durable achievement, I would say.
Okay, thank you so much, Virginie, Jalal, Imad. Our time is over. I thank you very much for your wonderful interventions, and so deep and so, so interesting. So thank you so much from ISPI and from me, of course.
Thank you.